Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she investigates a sound that no one else heard. A faint clink of glass echoing through a sleeping village at midnight. It came from a simple jar on the kitchen shelf, but inside it lay a secret meant to stay buried forever. Stay with me till the end, because the truth behind that sound isn't just chilling, it's unforgettable. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's mystery is worth every second. Until the very end. Chapter 1. The garden party that wasn't meant to end in murder. On the last Saturday of August, the village of Fernwood Hill bloomed with the kind of late summer enthusiasm only the English countryside could produce. It was the day of the annual garden harvest and jam tasting fair, hosted as always by Lady Agatha Hartwell on the gently sloping lawns of Rosewood Hall. The village had never missed the event. After all, there were prizes to be won: ribbons for the thickest gooseberry jam, the most fragrant lavender sachet, and this year, a new addition, best village memory preserved in a jar, an absurd idea, suggested by the vicar's rather poetic wife, Mrs. Elliot. Entrants were to place a memento or note inside a sealed jar alongside a pot of homemade jam. A sweet, sealed memory, she had described it. Miss Jane Marple, who rarely missed a village gathering, arrived punctually at 4 o'clock. She wore a pale blue straw hat trimmed with cornflowers and carried a small embroidered handbag, with nothing of real importance in it, at least, to the untrained eye. She made her way through the orchard aisle, past the stalls of local produce, until she found the tea tent. "I must say," she remarked gently to Mrs. Mapleton, the baker's widow, who had seated herself at one of the long trestle tables, "that I've never quite trusted gooseberry jam. It always seems to me a fruit with secrets." Mrs. Mapleton chuckled. "And what fruit doesn't have secrets in this village, Miss Marple?" It was, to all appearances, a perfectly lovely day. Children played near the pond. Reverend Elliot judged the jam contest with what he hoped was impartiality, and Lady Hartwell floated about like a forgetful swan, making notes on a gold clipboard and forgetting where she had set it down. But the illusion shattered rather suddenly. Quietly at first. It was 6:30 when the clink was heard. A peculiar, glassy, echoing sound, clink, 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 reverberated from the display tent, drawing a few glances. Most dismissed it as a jar knocked over by wind or a careless child. Then a scream pierced the garden, high, sharp, and from a woman. People rose to their feet. The scream had come from the jam tent, where the sealed memory jars had been laid out on long tables with white lace runners. Several villagers ran over. Lady Hartwell flapped uselessly in their wake. Miss Marple stood as well, but did not run. She moved at her own pace, calm, slow, observant. As she passed the hydrangeas lining the path, her hand lingered on one briefly, noting the way the petals had been crushed underfoot by a heel that didn't belong to a gardener's boot. Inside the tent, chaos had taken root. Mrs. Harriet Weaver, the village postmistress, stood beside the far table, trembling. Her hand covered her mouth, and her eyes were locked on the open jar before her. Inside, nestled among the folds of an embroidered tea napkin, lay a brooch silver, set with turquoise stones, and the unmistakably lifeless face of Mr. Giles Rendell, the clockmaker. He had been a recluse in recent years, only seen stepping into the bakery or quietly adjusting the hands of the old clock. Outside the town hall, he was not known to smile much. Now, he never would again. His body was sprawled behind the table, hidden from view by the lace drape. But it was clear to everyone gathered, especially Constable Fred Cotterill, who had arrived breathless from the nearby constabulary cottage, that Giles Rendell was dead. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply tilted her head and looked at the open jar. It was larger than the others and far too ornate for a village contest. One of those thick Italian canisters with a glass stopper and iron clasp. A curiously sophisticated choice for a rustic jam fair. And then there was the oddity of the clinking noise. Jars did not typically clink like that, especially not 3 times in quick succession. Like footsteps, or a warning. Constable Cotterill was flustered. Back now, everyone. Back, there's been an accident. Or, perhaps not her. I mean, we'll have to see. Please, everyone, remain calm. Miss Marple stepped a little closer. Not enough to be noticed. Just enough to hear. Wasn't it Lady Hartwell's idea to include that memory in a jar? Nonsense. Someone whispered nearby. No, that was Mrs. Elliot's thing. Then why is one of Lady Hartwell's jars the one with a corpse next to it? Miss Marple's gaze shifted slightly. Lady Hartwell, once pink-cheeked and fluttery, now stood a few paces away from the body, staring at the jar. Her hand trembled as she clutched the clipboard to her chest. Miss Marple gently touched her arm. My dear Lady Hartwell, would you perhaps like to sit? The excitement. It can rather upset the nerves. Lady Hartwell looked at her, unfocused. I didn't put that jar there. I swear I didn't. Mine had rosehip and orange marmalade. I remember I tied a pink ribbon round it. A pink ribbon? Miss Marple asked softly. Yes, Lady Hartwell said. With gold polka dots. I have a whole roll of it in the sewing room. That jar. That awful jar. It wasn't part of the contest. Miss Marple glanced back at the jar. No ribbon, no label. Just the clinking stopper. Now still, its sound echoing like a ghost across the lawn. Behind her, the murmurs were growing louder. Names were being whispered. Rendell hadn't spoken to his brother in 15 years. Mrs. Weaver had once been engaged to him. Lady Hartwell had accused him, years ago, of tampering with the church bell tower clock. And wasn't it curious how he still collected antique jewelry, including brooches like the one in the jar? Miss Marple turned away from the scene and quietly helped herself to a seat on the bench. Beside the jam tent. She folded her hands on her lap and looked out over the garden, which had gone quite still. I do wonder, she murmured softly, why anyone would hide a memory in a jar they didn't want anyone to open. And with that, the quiet unraveling of Fernwood on Hill had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers in the tea shoppy Sunday morning. The village of Fernwood on Hill had settled into the sort of hush that only follows a public scandal, one thick with whispered theories and boiling kettles. The church bell rang as usual at 9, but fewer than half the congregation filled the pews. Those who did attend spent more time glancing at one another than they did at Reverend Elliot's homily on temptation. Miss Marple, of course, was in attendance. She sat in her usual spot, third pew from the front, right-hand side, wearing a dove-gray hat and an expression that suggested she was only half listening. The other half of her mind was occupied with details, ribbons, brooches, crushed petals, and the peculiar echo of glass in a canvas tent. By noon, the whispers had grown teeth. At Grafton's tea shop, the hub of Fernwood's unofficial news service, teacups clinked with the same urgency as the fateful jar. Mrs. Mapleton sat nearest the window, flanked by Mrs. Dewhurst, the florist, and Miss Cora Pike, who ran the telephone exchange. That trio had not missed a single piece of gossip in 20 years, and they weren't about to start now. I heard, Cora whispered, leaning in over her scone, that Giles Rendell had a stroke right there in the tent. Poor soul must have collapsed. Double quotes. Mrs. Dewhurst shook her head with firm authority. No, the constable said there was bruising on the back of his head. Foul play, that's what it is. Murder. Cora repeated, half in horror and half in delight. Mrs. Mapleton nodded grimly. I always said he was the sort of man who would die clutching a grudge. Look how he treated his brother. What happened with his brother, anyway? Cora asked. There was a pause. No one quite remembered, only that it had been very dramatic, and that Mr. Rendell had stopped attending the Harvest Fair after 2012, the same year his brother Henry left for Wales under a cloud of debt. Miss Marple, seated just a few tables away, stirred her tea with gentle patience. She hadn't needed to ask. It was more effective to listen. People forgot you were there when you didn't interrupt. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap today, but her mind was anything but still. The mystery of the clinking jar had already begun to sort itself into subtle threads. Lady Hartwell, for one, had been visibly shaken. Not by the body. Miss Marple had seen more than one lady of status take a fainting turn at the sight of blood, but by the jar. Her insistence that it wasn't hers had struck Miss Marple as sincere, and the ribbon, no pink ribbon, had been found near the brooch. Then there was the odd fact of the brooch itself, silver with turquoise, Art Deco in design. Miss Marple knew such pieces were hard to come by in recent years. Expensive, too. And yet, it had been stuffed into the folds of a tea towel like an afterthought. Miss Marple. She looked up gently to see the wide-eyed face of Susan Felton, a girl of 17 with an unfortunate habit of speaking without thinking. "Oh, hello, dear," she said kindly. "Do sit." Susan obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair like she feared it might collapse beneath her nerves. Have you heard what they're saying about Mrs. Weaver?" "I hear many things," Miss Marple said delicately. "Why don't you tell me what you've heard?" "Well," Susan lowered her voice to a whisper, "Mrs. Weaver was once engaged to Mr. Rendell. Ages ago, before I was born. My mum said he jilted her for someone else. And then that woman left him, and he came back alone." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "That would be Miss Laurel Hemsley, wouldn't it?" Susan blinked. "You remember her?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple replied, eyes distant. "She was a nurse. Came to care for the Colonel when he broke his leg. Left with Mr. Rendell shortly after. It was all very quick." Susan leaned in. "And get this, Mrs. Weaver never married anyone else. Isn't that strange?" "Not so strange," Miss Marple said gently. "Some people hold onto the idea of love more dearly than love itself." Susan frowned, unsure what that meant, and Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, dear. That's been most helpful." After the girl left, Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly and stood. She made her way through the winding lanes of the village toward the post office, her mind filled not with gossip, but with rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. It had not been the sound of glass tipping over. It had been deliberate, patterned. She paused beside the ivy-covered wall near the post office door. Behind it stood a man whose gait was uneven. One Mr. Arnold Phipps, a former school teacher who had once been seen arguing with Giles Rendell over a watch repair. She made note of the way Mr. Phipps tapped his walking stick 3 times before each turn. Clink, clink, clink. But that hadn't been it. It wasn't a cane tapping. It wasn't glass falling. It was glass being closed, latched. A memory sparked. Miss Marple had seen jars like that before, not just in kitchens, in chemists' cabinets, and in bank safes. The heavy Italian jar, the one with the iron clasp, those were sometimes used by collectors, not for jam, but for keepsakes, for valuables. That jar had not been submitted as part of the contest. Someone had brought it sealed, hidden in plain sight, and only when the clasp was triggered, when the jar was opened, had the clinking noise occurred. Someone had known the jar would be opened during the judging. Someone had planned the exact moment of discovery. Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the small alley beside the post office. A movement there caught her attention. A figure, quick, furtive. The scent of lavender wafted past, not the soft kind found in sachets, but the sharp, medicinal variety, lavender oil, used to mask other smells. Or perhaps the smell of death. She made a mental note. There, were more than memories hidden in that jar. There were secrets someone had worked very hard to preserve until the moment they wished to break them open. Chapter 3. Miss Marple listens. While others chase shadows on Monday morning, Fernwood on Hill did what it always did in the wake of disruption. It pressed onward. With a stubborn semblance of normality, the post office reopened, though Mrs. Weaver's hands shook slightly as she weighed out stamps. The tea shop served its custard slices, albeit under an unspoken cloud of morbid curiosity. And Constable Fred Cotterill began what he referred to as a full investigation, which mostly involved knocking on doors and scribbling in a notebook that flapped wildly in the wind. Miss Marple, of course, did no knocking at all. She spent her morning wandering quietly, taking tea with a few long-time villagers and letting them talk. It was extraordinary what people confessed over a second cup of Earl Grey. By midday, she had learned that Mr. Rendell had recently visited Lady Hartwell's estate not to repair a clock, as most assumed, but to view her late husband's coin collection. Odd little visit, Lady Hartwell had told her over lemon biscuits. He didn't touch the coins at all, just stood there looking at them, then asked for a glass of water and left. Elsewhere, Mrs. Deworst confided that she had seen a light on in Mr. Rendell's workshop late Friday evening, well past 11, which for him was most unusual, and in a quiet moment behind the church. Young Timothy Wicks, no older than 10, admitted shyly that he had seen someone carrying a box wrapped in a towel into the jam tent before the fair began. Didn't see who, he said. Just saw the towel slip. It was glass, big, had a funny latch. Miss Marple smiled gently. Did it clink, dear? Timothy nodded. Yes, ma'am, twice, like a click-click. Then the flap closed behind them. She gave him a barley sugar from her pocket and thanked him kindly. By the time the church bells struck 3, Constable Cotterill was already convinced he had his prime suspect. I don't mean to cast stones, he told Reverend Elliot, whom he had pulled aside after a short stroll through the churchyard. But it seems to me that Mrs. Weaver had both motive and access. Former fiancé, never married, still lived alone, embarrassed by gossip, saw him with Lady Hartwell. Could have snapped. The Reverend's brow furrowed with discomfort. I find it difficult to imagine Mrs. Weaver harming anyone. Yes, well, said Cotterill, slightly deflated. Love does strange things. Behind them. Miss Marple knelt in the garden, pretending to inspect the rose border. In truth, she had already noted the footprints near the back of the vestrymen's shoes, one slightly dragging on the left. Not Constable Cotterill's, not the Reverend's. Something in her memory stirred. Dragging step. Clink-clink. Mer. Phipps. She filed it away. Not yet a theory, just a rhythm in the background. Later that evening, a group of villagers gathered in the pub, as they often did when scandal brewed. The Hartwell Arms was thick with pipe smoke and speculation. Mrs. Deworst, despite her usual gentility, was loud in her condemnation of the dead. Let's not forget, she said with her pint half lifted, that Giles Rendell wasn't a kind man. He hoarded old watches like they were treasure, kept ledgers locked up, and never once forgave his brother, didn't even attend his mother's funeral. He was blackmailing someone, muttered Mr. Tom Holloway, who'd once tried to buy a clock off Giles and been turned down with no explanation. That's right, said a voice in the back. Remember the whole thing with the antique brooch years ago? Went missing from Lady Hartwell's dressing table. Never found. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the hearth with a cup of weak sherry, allowed herself the faintest lift of an eyebrow. The brooch. The same brooch. Lady Hartwell had said nothing about it missing now. In fact, she'd denied knowledge of the jar altogether. And yet was it possible someone had used the brooch to make a statement, to frame her? Or perhaps no, best not to guess too early. Guessing was the sport of those who fancied themselves detectives. Miss Marple preferred to listen. It was during the walk home from the pub that she found herself accompanied by Major Harold Bent, retired artillery and self-declared protector of Fernwood's good name. He offered his arm, and Miss Marple accepted it out of courtesy. Wicked thing, murder. He grunted. But I dare say it's an open and shut case. Either that Weaver woman or Phipps, if you ask me. They were both jealous types. He over clocks, she over people. Miss Marple smiled politely. Jealousy often masks something else entirely. He grunted again. Still, strange that the only person who liked Giles Rendell was young Miss Finch. Ah, yes, said Miss Marple mildly. The chemist's niece. Quite. Came here from London 2 months ago. Keeps to herself, mostly, but always said hello to Rendell. Used to meet him at the bakery early on Thursdays. Regular like. How observant of you. Major, I may be retired, Miss Marple, but I don't walk around with my eyes shut. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely turned her thoughts to Miss Finch, a London girl, quiet, fond of Mr. Rendell. Working at a chemist's, skilled with oils. She had worn lavender water, hadn't she? Sharp and astringent. Not floral. Not perfume. A masking agent. She paused before her cottage gate. Thank you, Major. I do believe I've walked far enough. He nodded. Good night, Miss Marple. Don't let the ghouls in. She watched him go, then turned and looked down the street. The village lights glowed dimly behind curtain lace. Somewhere behind one of those windows, someone had planned a murder to unfold in public view. Deliberate, timed, hidden in the innocent guise of memory. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Memory was, after all, never innocent. Chapter 4. The first suspect, Mrs. Weaver in the spotlight. Tuesday morning. The tea leaves in Fernwood on Hill were no longer being read for romance or fortune. They were being studied for clues, and according to the morning crowd at Grafton's tea shop, one name was floating like a soggy biscuit at the top of every conversation. Mrs. Harriet Weaver. It wasn't just her link to the late Giles Rendell, though, that alone would have been enough. It was her silence, her absence from the usual village rhythms, and, perhaps most damning of all, the fact that no one could quite remember seeing her jar on the competition table. Did she even submit anything? Whispered Mrs. Deworst as she stirred her tea vigorously. All I saw was that awful clinking jar before she screamed. I did see her walking toward the tent before it happened, offered Cora Pike, with something wrapped in a dishcloth. Could have been anything, grumbled Mrs. Mapleton, but she looked pale, nervous. And you remember she once threw a spoon at Mr. Rendell in the post office? That was in 1998. Someone muttered. Still counts, Mrs. Mapleton snapped. Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly in the corner, as was her custom. She had learned long ago that speculation has its uses not for truth, but for tone. And the tone of the village was growing sharp and narrow, like a blade honing itself on repetition. The official direction of the investigation soon caught up. By midday, Constable Cotterill was knocking on the door of Mrs. Weaver's stone cottage. At the end of Lavender Row, Miss Marple happened to be walking her customary route past the flower stalls coincidentally, of course, and paused near the gate just as the door creaked open. Mrs. Weaver stood framed in the threshold, her usual brisk posture diminished. She wore a faded cardigan over a blouse that had once been lemon yellow, and her eyes were tired. Not the swollen red of recent tears, but the dry, haunted look of someone holding herself together by habit. Mrs. Weaver, Cotterill said, clearing his throat, I'd like to ask a few questions. If you don't mind. I do mind, she replied softly. But I suppose that doesn't change anything, Miss. Marple lingered only a moment, long enough to note the muddy scuff marks just inside the door and the faint scent of vinegar and rosewater, then moved on. She had no desire to eavesdrop. Others would do that well enough. What interested her was not what Mrs. Weaver would say, but what others would claim she had said. By evening, the village buzzed with second-hand versions of the interrogation. She confessed, declared Mr. Holloway confidently at the Hartwell Arms, said she put the brooch in the jar herself. Some sort of symbol, like revenge. No, she denied everything. Countered Cora Pike, said she hadn't even seen Giles since April, that she was as shocked as the rest of us. She's lying, said Mrs. Deworst. You can always tell with women like her. To quiet, Miss Marple, seated as always with her knitting in hand, chose not to contribute, but her mind drifted to something Lady Hartwell had said just the day before. I didn't put that jar on the table, the lady had insisted. I had a pink ribbon round mine with polka dots. It was next to the lavender jelly. Everyone saw it. But if Lady Hartwell's jar was there, and Mrs. Weaver's wasn't, then whose was the clinking jar? Perhaps more interesting still, who had been the judge who opened the jar. Miss Marple recalled that Reverend Elliot had been the final taster in the memory jar category, and the clinking hadn't occurred until the third jar was opened. So the mysterious container had not just appeared. It had been deliberately placed third in the judging order, meaning someone had known exactly when it would be opened, and by whom. She made a note to speak with the Reverend the following afternoon. She found him in his study, wrestling with his sermon for the coming Sunday. It was to be on the theme of unseen burdens, an apt choice, Miss Marple thought. Ah, Miss Marple, he said with a warm, if distracted, smile. Come for spiritual advice. In a manner of speaking, she replied with a twinkle. I wonder if you might indulge my curiosity, just for a moment. Always, it's about the jars. The contest, of course. He waved a hand vaguely. Not my idea, you know. That was Eleanor's, a preserved memory, she called it. Terribly sentimental, but it captured everyone's imagination. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Quite the idea. Tell me, do you remember whose jar you opened last? The one that caused such commotion? The Reverend leaned back, eyes narrowing with thought. Well, let's see. First was Mrs. Pike's, had a note inside about her husband's proposal in the rain. Terribly sweet. Second was little Peter Blunt, he'd sealed in a toy boat made of twigs. And third, the unlabeled one. Heavy, I remember thinking it odd. No ribbon, no name. When I opened it, well, you know the rest. Indeed. Do you think someone meant for me to open it? Miss Marple, she gave a small smile. I think someone meant for someone to open it, and you just happened to be the one following the list. The Reverend looked uncomfortable. It's terrible, you know. The brooch. I recognized it. Lady Hartwell's. She used to wear it every Sunday. I hadn't seen it in years. That confirmed it. The brooch had vanished long ago, and now it had reappeared, entangled in murder. Miss Marple took her leave not long after, the wheels in her mind turning steadily. Mrs. Weaver may have had motive. She may have had access, but nothing about her personality spoke of theatrical displays. A public murder? A symbolic object? A jar meant to be opened in front of an entire village? No. Mrs. Weaver's heartbreak had settled long ago into resignation, and her grief was private, not performative, which meant someone wanted her to look guilty. The brooch had not been a message from Mrs. Weaver. It had been a trap for her, planted by someone who knew how to draw suspicion, someone clever enough to manipulate community memory, exploit a past romance, and orchestrate an entire timeline around an innocent country fair. Miss Marple returned home that evening to her small, orderly cottage. She poured herself a cup of weak chamomile, then sat by the window and opened her notebook. In neat, looping script, she wrote 3 names: Mrs. Weaver, heartbroken; quiet, convenient; Lady Hartwell, brooch owner. Seemed shocked, but careless. Miss Finch, new, observant, lavender oil. Friendly with the victim. She underlined the 3rd name once. then leaned back and waited. Someone she knew would slip. They always did. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Something out of place, yet carefully left behind. Thursday morning broke pale and damp, the kind of English summer day that carried more mist than sunlight. Fernwood on Hill had returned to its routines, or pretended to. The grocer had resumed weighing potatoes, the milkman clinked bottles onto doorsteps, and the vicar rehearsed for his Sunday sermon, as if the village had not recently played host to a murder. But even in the lull, something lingered in the air, a weight, like a book left open at a page no one dared finish reading. Miss Marple spent the morning in her garden, snipping dead heads from the dahlias and trimming back a rose bush that had grown over-curious. She found the rhythm of gardening useful. It gave the hand something to do, while the mind roamed freely. And today, her mind was wandering to jars. Not the brooch, not the murder, not even Mrs. Weaver's trembling hands, but the jar itself, specifically. A memory jar with no label, no ribbon, no jam, and no entry card left in the middle of a contest that prided itself on perfect presentation. Who, in a village of such fussy detail and polite competition, would ever dream of submitting something so deliberately blank? They had to be someone who knew that the appearance of carelessness would not be questioned, or more precisely that it would be questioned in exactly the right way. After a light lunch of cucumber sandwiches, Miss Marple set out. Her feet took her to the back of Rosewood Hall, where Lady Hartwell had spent much of the morning overseeing her gardener's pruning of the yew hedge. "Oh, Miss Marple," Lady Hartwell called, voice floating through the trimmed archway. "What a week this has been. I hardly know where I've put anything. You had a very large crowd at the fair." Miss Marple replied mildly, "It's no surprise things were misplaced." Lady Hartwell gave a harried laugh. "Do you know, I still can't find my jam ribbon. The polka dot one. The whole roll has vanished, and the sewing room's in disarray." "Oh dear," Miss Marple said, her gaze softening. "May I?" She followed Lady Hartwell through the side door and into the sewing room, a sunlit nook that smelled of beeswax and cotton thread. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly over the space, spools tipped, scissors gleaming, an overturned pin cushion, and, near the corner of the window seat, a scrap of fabric stuck to the edge of the baseboard. With a small movement, she bent to retrieve it. "May I ask," she said gently, "if anyone else has had access to this room in the past few days?" Lady Hartwell looked puzzled. "Only Mary, my maid, and young Miss Finch. Come to think of it, she borrowed a needle and thread to mend her sleeve during setup for the fair." Miss Marple held the fabric scrap up to the light. It wasn't polka-dotted. It was a tightly woven cotton with an unusually flat weave, sturdy, utilitarian, and white. The kind of cloth often used in medical bandages. Or for wrapping something fragile. Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag with a quiet nod. "You know, Lady Hartwell," she said, "I've often thought sewing rooms have the best gossip of all. They keep little secrets tucked into the hems." Lady Hartwell laughed, confused but charmed. Miss Marple thanked her and excused herself. Her next stop was the village green, where Miss Finch stood outside the chemist's shop arranging a display of travel-sized soaps and hand lotion. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Lovely arrangement. I do admire the symmetry." "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple," Miss Finch smiled. "I find order soothes the mind." "I've always believed that," Miss Marple agreed. "In fact, I wonder, when you helped at the fair, did you happen to notice anything out of order? Something that struck you as not quite right?" Miss Finch hesitated. "Well, actually, yes. I found a small slip of paper behind the jam tent on Sunday afternoon. Thought it was rubbish at first, but then I saw the handwriting." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Handwriting, you say?" "Yes, it was a list, 3 names, I think. I remember it because one of them was mine." Miss Finch, just like that. I thought it might be from one of the entry cards, but it wasn't official. Did you keep it? Miss Finch flushed. No, I threw it away. I was embarrassed. It felt like I'd seen something I shouldn't. Miss Marple smiled kindly, her eyes warm. It's all right, my dear. Sometimes the smallest things turn out to matter most. She walked away slowly, but her mind was racing. A list of names. Not in the judging ledger, but separate, private, hidden. Someone had been tracking potential reactions. Who would care how each person would respond to a particular jar? Someone who planned for that jar to be opened and for its contents to make an impact. Not just on the judges, but on witnesses. Miss Marple returned home by late afternoon and placed the cloth scrap from Lady Hartwell's sewing room on her table. She compared it with another square from her medicine drawer. Same weave, same thickness, bandage cloth. She made herself a weak cup of tea and sat in the parlor, surrounded by gentle ticking from her antique mantel clock. And then it struck her, time. The jar had been placed before the fair began. It had been timed perfectly. It had needed to sit unnoticed until the precise moment of the judging. And yet it had also contained something fragile. A brooch, yes, but also something else, a scent. The faint whiff of lavender, not floral, but medicinal. And time to release. Miss Marple rose and retrieved her handbag. She pulled out the torn cloth again, this time sniffing it gently. Yes, lavender, but also something sharper underneath. Camphor. It wasn't just bandage cloth. It had been soaked, prepared, used to line the jar so the scent would release when opened. Why? To trigger memory? Or to mask something else? She paused. People remembered the brooch, yes, but they smelled the jar first. That was the first shock, the first trigger. It was meant to transport them to a memory, to something painful, something personal, and someone had studied exactly how to do that. Not a villager, not a widow, not a retired clockmaker, but someone trained in scent, in calming nerves, in quiet control. Someone like Miss Finch. Chapter 6. A spot of blackberry jam. Morning sun bathed St. Hedwig's Lane in a soft golden light, brushing the dew from hedgerows and warming the slate rooftops. At number 14, a polished black hearse stood discreetly outside the Briar cottage, and a small, respectful crowd gathered behind the low stone wall. The body of Mr. Geoffrey Lowndes was to be taken for examination in Much Benningfield, where the police surgeon would determine the precise cause of death. The village, however, had already decided he'd been poisoned. It were the gooseberry tart, muttered Mrs. Hartley Smith, clutching her handbag as though it were a shield. Or maybe the chutney. I never trusted chutney. No, dear, said Reverend Pritchard's wife, a tall and brittle woman with a fondness for dramatic flair. I heard from Doris at the bakery that it was the jam, blackberry, a spot of blackberry jam on his sleeve. Miss Marple, who had joined the small circle beside the vicarage hedge, raised her eyebrows. That's curious, she murmured gently. I don't recall any blackberry items served at the garden party. Mrs. Hartley Smith leaned in, triumphant. Ah, but the Colonel had his own picnic basket, didn't he? He brought it for that little competition, the homemade preserves contest. Only he never opened it, noted the vicar's wife, with a touch of scandal. I remember clearly. He said it was for later. Miss Marple nodded faintly, her hands resting on the handle of her parasol. The details were beginning to collect, not facts, perhaps, but feelings, the subtle frictions that lived between the lines of ordinary conversation. Later that day, Constable Hargreaves made his way to Miss Marple's cottage. He was a sturdy young man, earnest but not particularly imaginative. His knuckles rapped the painted doorframe with the same uncertain rhythm of a man requesting advice. He couldn't officially ask for Miss Marple, he said, hat in hand. Might I trouble you for a moment? You may trouble me for two if it's important, she said cheerily. "Come alongin." He stepped over the threshold, looking sheepish. "They've sent an inspector from Much Benningfield. Inspector Featherstone. Senior man, very sharp. But truth be told, you don't know little Bindledown like you do." Miss Marple offered him tea, which he declined. "They're saying poison," he continued, glancing toward the hearth. "There was a faint residue in the Colonel's teacup, but it's not clear how it got there. No one else seems affected. And there's this odd thing. A broken jar was found near the terrace hedge. Smashed, but still with a bit of jam inside." "Blackberry?" Miss Marple asked without missing a beat. Hargreaves blinked. "Yes, how'd you?" "Only a guess. People don't smash strawberry jars. Far too sweet to waste." He stared, unsure if she was joking. "Tell me, was the broken jar found near the bin?" she asked. "No, oddly enough. Tucked behind one of the flower tubs, as if someone tried to hide it." Miss Marple murmured, knitting her fingers. "What a curious thing. And the competition basket. Has anyone looked inside it?" Hargreaves shifted. "We haven't found it. Mrs. Preston swears she saw him carrying it, but it's gone." "Ah," she said quietly. "That is interesting." The arrival of Inspector Featherstone brought a crispness to the sleepy air of the village, a man of tweed and tension. He set up camp in the sitting room of the Colonel's home and began his interrogations. Villagers were summoned one by one, offering fragmented accounts laced with their own prejudices and hunches. Miss Marple, invited as a courtesy rather than a suspect, watched with the mild expression of someone solving a knitting pattern. She didn't offer much, merely an observation or two when asked. Featherstone, though polite, was dismissive. "These villagers have their heads full of gossip and scones. I'd bet a month's salary this was a crime of opportunity. A domestic matter. We'll pin it down soon enough." "But isn't it often the case," Miss Marple said gently, "that it looks domestic only because someone wishes it to?" He blinked at her, nonplussed, and then returned to his notebook. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a walk. Her destination was not random. She strolled past Ivy Lodge, the home of Edith Norris, whose hands had trembled slightly when offering the Colonel his third cup of tea. She had seemed composed at the party, but Miss Marple recalled a flicker of something: discomfort, hesitation. At the gate, she found Edith herself, pruning her hydrangeas with more aggression than precision. "Oh, Miss Marple," Edith said, attempting a smile. "Come to admire the late blooms? Or perhaps to admire your jam," said Miss Marple kindly. Edith blinked, lowering the shears. "My jam? Didn't you submit something to the Colonel's preserve contest? I thought I remembered a little tag with your handwriting." Edith hesitated. "Yes, well, I meant to. Blackberry. But I changed my mind. The batch was underset." "Ah," said Miss Marple, nodding. "And did you happen to bring the jar anyway?" A pause, then Edith swallowed. "I might have. I suppose I forgot it on the day." Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Of course, easy to do. But blackberry jam is rather dark, isn't it? Hard to see if something's added to it." Edith's hand gripped the shears tighter. Miss Marple touched her wrist softly. "You mustn't worry, my dear. No one is accusing you. But you do understand how these things can look peculiar, especially if jars go missing." Edith gave a shaky breath. I didn't poison anyone, no," said Miss Marple softly. "But someone did, and I think they hoped you might appear to." That evening, the church bells rang for evensong, but the whispers around the pews weren't about psalms. They were about the jam, the missing basket, and poor Edith Norris. Miss Marple returned home and took out a box of postcards. She sorted through them, looking for one from her niece in Shropshire. The front bore a photo of a wild blackberry bramble, its dark berries glistening under a cloudy sky. Miss Marple looked at it a long time before setting it aside. Things were beginning to take shape. The colonel had brought a basket that no one had seen since. A jar of blackberry jam had mysteriously shattered near the scene. Edith had motive, but it felt too easy. And then there was the sound. The sound no one had quite explained. A soft clink, heard at midnight. Miss Marple turned toward her fireplace and poked at the coals. "It's not always the obvious jar," she said aloud, to no one in particular. "Sometimes it's the one that doesn't quite belong." Chapter 7. Another shiver in the night. Days after Edwin Crouch's death passed in a strange, unspoken hush over St. Hedwig's. Even the birds seemed quieter. The roses in bloom heavy with silence. Life had not stopped. Bakeries still opened. The postman still walked his route, but there was a stiffness to every nod, a hesitation in every greeting. And still, no one had seen Miss Marple at the post office or morning grocer's. Though her lace curtains remained slightly parted, ever watching, she wasn't idle. Miss Marple had spent the better part of 2 evenings organizing her memories. Quiet fragments of conversation, hesitant glances, overly casual statements, each one pinned like a butterfly in her mental display case. She had seen this before. Not the crime exactly, but the behavior, the careful avoidance of a truth that squirmed beneath genteel words. And now, she needed to test her understanding. That meant tea with someone who wouldn't suspect she was being observed. So Miss Marple invited Clara Penwright. Clara arrived promptly, hat slightly askew and cheeks flushed, apologizing for nothing of a delay. "Tea's warm still," Miss Marple assured her, "and I've tried a new sponge, with lemon and poppy seed. One must have novelty now and then." Clara smiled, but the set of her mouth seemed tense. Miss Marple poured tea with her usual grace, then waited, as one does with birds, for Clara to sing of her own will. "I suppose we're all still reeling, aren't we?" Clara finally offered, stirring her tea until the spoon clinked nervously. "I can't imagine who would want to hurt Edwin. Not Edwin of all people. Oh, I should think there are people who'd find him quite tiresome," Miss Marple replied mildly. "We all have faults, some more visible than others." Clara blinked. "Well, he did complain. But that's hardly cause for—" She broke off, biting her lip. "I suppose I just keep hoping the police find something conclusive." Miss Marple nodded kindly. "And how's young Terence taking it? Mr. Digby mentioned he was quite affected." "Oh yes," Clara leaned in slightly, grateful to change the subject. "Terence is beside himself. He keeps walking the woods alone, muttering to himself. The shock, you know. He's always been a delicate boy, artistic and all that. Edwin was awful to him, awful." Clara looked away. "Well, not violent or anything, but cruel in a way that bruises don't show. Said Terence's paintings were childish. Threatened to evict him." Miss Marple's fingers paused over the biscuit plate. "That does sound rather unpleasant." Clara gave a small sigh. Edwin knew how to needle people. "Still murder? Surely not Terence." "No," said Miss Marple softly. "But I wonder what Terence might have heard. Or seen." She let the statement hang like a cat's paw just brushing the curtain hem. Clara blinked, as if a deeper thought had crept up behind her and tapped her shoulder. But she said nothing more of substance. Later that evening, Miss Marple took a quiet stroll to the vicarage, nodding politely to passersby. There was no need to be secretive. In a village such as this, a secret visit would be noticed more than an open one. The Reverend Hargreaves greeted her warmly. He was in his study, his pipe unlit beside an open copy of the Daily Mail, which Miss Marple noted had an article on psychological delusions in veterans. "Jane, always a pleasure," he said. Come in. It's a grim business, isn't it?" Miss Marple took the offered seat, glancing at the newspaper before folding her hands. "I was wondering if you'd permit me to ask, had Mr. Crouch come to you for guidance of late?" The Reverend considered. "Twice this past month, in fact, which was rare. He usually avoided me unless there was a council vote. and what was the nature of his concerns. The vicar hesitated, then sighed. He believed someone was threatening him. He wouldn't say who, but he was rattled, said he was being followed, that someone had been inside his cottage without breaking anything. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed a fraction. Did he mention anything being taken? No, but he did mention hearing things. Something about a sound late at night. A clink, I think he said, like glass on metal. Woke him up. Miss Marple sat very still. Did he describe the sound more specifically? The vicar frowned. Yes, actually. He said it reminded him of an old jar. A jar of coins, perhaps. It clinked once, then stopped. That was the night he first suspected someone had been inside. Miss Marple rose with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Reverend. That's most enlightening. She walked home slowly, thoughts moving faster than her steps. A jar, a clink. At midnight, when she returned, she lit a small lamp in the parlor, fetched her notebook, and began listing the suspects again, this time with a new column titled, Motive Strong Enough to Kill for Silence. The next morning, a new whisper fluttered down the hedgerows and into the post office. Terence Hollingsworth had gone missing. He hadn't returned to his rented room after supper at the Ploughman's Rest. His landlady, Mrs. Fern, found his door open, bed unslept in, and his easel knocked over. The paints were still wet. The village reeled once more. Had the young man run away out of grief, or guilt, or had the killer struck again? Miss Marple closed her sitting room window quietly and turned toward the kettle. The game, she feared, was not yet over, and someone who had clinked a jar at midnight was still playing. Chapter 8. The painted Cluterance Hollingsworth's disappearance cast a longer, darker shadow than Edwin Crouch's death had. It was as though the village had been holding its breath after the murder, and now, with the vanishing of a second soul, that breath had turned into a gasp. Miss Marple sat in her parlor with the window cracked open, the scent of the late summer roses wafting in. From here, she could hear the tremble in the voices outside, the neighbors trading whispers like illicit goods. It had begun. The shift from mourning to fear, that peculiar silence between tragedy and suspicion was ending, and now came the unraveling. She was waiting for someone. Not an official invitation, of course, but in her experience, such people always came eventually. And sure enough, just after the clock struck 11, Inspector Cray knocked twice, firm and efficient. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Come in, Inspector. Tea or something stronger?" "Tea," he said, stepping inside with the posture of a man used to bad news. "If it's not too much trouble." She handed him a fresh cup before he even sat down. "Lemon balm. Good for clarity." Cray allowed himself a tired smile. "Could do with a bit of that." They sat across from each other in her modest parlor, the scent of citrus mingling with faint lavender. Miss Marple took a sip first, giving him space. "Any word on the boy?" Cray shook his head. "Nothing. Not a sighting, not a note. No signs of forced entry at the Ploughman's Rest. But something about the state of his room bothers me." "How so?" "The easel. It had fallen, but not naturally. It looked shoved, but nothing else in the room was disturbed. Odd thing to knock over if it was just panic or packing in a rush." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Might I ask a favor, Inspector?" He arched an eyebrow. "Depends. I'd like to see the room." Cray sighed but didn't say no. "You've been helpful before, but you'll keep it quiet, as the grave," she said lightly. The Ploughman's Rest smelled faintly of old beer and lavender polish. Mrs. Fern, a pinched woman with high-arched eyebrows and a voice like a chisel on stone, led them upstairs. "Didn't touch a thing, Inspector. Not since I found it this morning. It gave me a fright." They entered Terence's small room. Pale curtains filtered the daylight, casting a dusty glow over the scene. Miss Marple stepped inside with practiced grace, eyes scanning quickly. The bed was untouched. A half-finished cup of tea on the sill. The easel was indeed knocked over, and beside it, a streak of bright red paint smudged across the floorboards like blood in moonlight. She crouched beside it. Still wet, she murmured. Not a smear from a foot or hand. Almost like it was placed there. Inspector Cray frowned. What do you mean? Suppose, she said slowly, Terence wasn't taken. Suppose he left something behind. She reached for the palette and brush still lying nearby. The red was fresh, not from the larger canvas, but from a smaller one leaning behind the dresser nearly hidden. She gently pulled it into view. It was a portrait, stark, unsettling, and undeniably expressive. At its center, Edwin Crouch, painted not with reverence, but rage. His expression was twisted, almost grotesque, the lines exaggerated like a satirical puppet. Behind him, barely visible, was another figure, shadowy, indistinct, but clearly watching from the background. Cray whistled low. That's bold. Miss Marple tilted her head. Look closer at the background, just there near the bookshelf. Do you see it? He leaned in. That's a jar. Yes, she said. A small glass jar, with coins in it. Cray blinked. The same sound Crouch mentioned to the vicar. A clink, like a jar being moved. You think Terence knew about it? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, Terence saw something. Perhaps the night Edwin died or the night before. He painted what he couldn't say. And now, someone else has seen it too. Cray looked grim. And silenced him for it? She shook her head. Not necessarily. I think Terence ran. Why? Miss Marple pointed to the edges of the canvas. Smudged fingerprints. Rushed. He hid the painting. Not carefully, but with purpose. And he left no clothes behind. See, the wardrobe's been opened and shut. A scarf missing from the hook. This wasn't abduction. It was escape. Cray considered this. So he's afraid. But of what? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is the question, isn't it? That evening, the air in the village thickened. Miss Marple made another quiet visit, this time to Harold Digby's house. He answered the door in shirt sleeves, blinking as if pulled from a nap. Miss Marple, what a surprise. I find surprises are best served over tea, she said briskly. May I come in? He hesitated, but she walked past him before he could answer. Inside, the house smelled of burnt toast and linseed oil. Harold's wife was away visiting family. Miss Marple had heard as much at the grocer's. She moved straight to the sitting room, eyes flicking to the mantel where photographs of the town council were proudly displayed. I must ask, Harold, did you ever notice anything peculiar about Edwin Crouch before his death? Harold snorted. He was peculiar by design, always muttering about conspiracies and council fraud. Honestly, Jane, if you're thinking someone wanted him dead, oh, I think many wanted him dead, she said sweetly. But I'm not interested in want. I'm interested in fear. Harold stiffened. Fear? Terence painted something disturbing before he disappeared. A figure in the background of Edwin's world, watching him. And a jar, always the jar. Coins, perhaps, or something else. You were close to Edwin. Did he ever mention what was in that jar? Harold's mouth opened, then closed. And then he laughed, forced, loud, unnatural. You're reading too many mystery novels, Jane, she smiled. And you, dear Harold, are underestimating how well I know you. She let that hang as she stood. Do pass on my greetings to your wife when she returns. And if you should happen to find a painting, or a letter perhaps, tucked somewhere it doesn't belong, do let the inspector know. She left him standing there, mouth thin, eyes stormy, back at home. Miss Marple returned to her notebook. She drew a simple line across the page and wrote, 3 truths remain. Edwin Crouch was being watched. Terence painted what he saw and fled. The jar of coins is not coins at all. Outside, the wind picked up. Clouds gathered. The village of St. Hedwig's held its breath once more. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly and whispered, "Now we wait." Chapter 9. Miss Marple's final test. Following morning dawned with the hesitant light of a village uncertain how to wake after such grim revelations. The storm of speculation had not passed, merely settled into a murmur, persistent and troubling like the low buzzing of a wasp in a teacup. Inside the vicarage, a kettle whistled softly as Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, stirring her tea with uncharacteristic deliberation. "Something's not right," she said gently, more to herself than to her companion. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, pouring herself a modest helping of porridge, looked up. "You mean the girl's death?" Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "No, that's perfectly dreadful, of course. But no, I meant something closer, something personal. People speak too much when they're hiding, and too little when they're afraid of truth. I believe we've had both." She rose without finishing her tea. "I think I should take a short walk, dear. The air helps clear the mind." Outdoors, St. Hedwig's Lane was cool and crisp with morning dew. Miss Marple's steps, while measured, were purposeful. She passed the green, the post office, and made her way to the rear of the Black Finch Inn, where Mr. Denholm was inspecting a delivery of root vegetables with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed almost too cheerfully, "do join me. I've just acquired the most splendid parsnips. I do enjoy a good parsnip," she replied pleasantly. "But I was wondering, Mr. Denholm, have you found that small key yet? The one to the back pantry door?" His eyes narrowed. "Key? Oh no, not yet. I suppose it's been misplaced during the chaos, or deliberately hidden," she replied softly, her tone barely rising above the breeze. "One never knows. Such small things can lock away rather large truths." His smile faltered. "Well, if I find it, I'll let you know. But surely that has nothing to do with poor Lillian?" Miss Marple gave him a kind smile. "Oh, I never said it did." With that, she moved along, past the white gate into the small courtyard, shared by two cottages, one inhabited by Mr. and Mrs. Channing, and the other, until recently, by Lillian. She stopped at the Channing doorstep and knocked. Mrs. Channing appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a flour-stained apron. "Miss Marple," she said with stiff cordiality, "can I help you? If you don't mind, dear, a cup of tea would be lovely. I find myself in need of a familiar conversation, though hesitant." Mrs. Channing nodded and led her in. Inside, the sitting room bore signs of neglect. A teacup unwashed, dust along the mantel. Miss Marple glanced about gently, noting the absence of fresh flowers. "You haven't been sleeping well," she remarked casually. Mrs. Channing startled. "How did you?" "Just a guess," Miss Marple interrupted kindly. These sorts of things were heavily on the nerves. The two women sat, sipping lukewarm tea. Miss Marple took a polite sip, then set the cup down. "Tell me, dear, why did you let Lillian borrow your teapot last week?" Mrs. Channing blinked. I didn't. "Oh, that's curious, because Mrs. Pomfrey mentioned she saw Lillian carrying your floral Wedgwood down the path last Thursday." Double quotes. Mrs. Channing's hand trembled slightly. "She might have taken it without asking. I wouldn't know, of course. Only I found it odd. You see, Lillian didn't drink tea. Never could bear the taste. Said so herself at the Women's Guild last month." There was a long silence. Then Miss Marple stood. "We all lie, my dear, usually to protect something, but sometimes to hide something too late to undo." She left without further comment, allowing the silence to settle like dust. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple was met by Constable Griggs, who had been sent to deliver a copy of Lillian's employment records. The envelope had been opened. "Curious," she said quietly. "Lillian wasn't just a waitress in London. She was a companion to an elderly woman who died 6 months ago." The vicar glanced up from his sermon notes. That seems a significant change in profession, quite, especially as the woman left behind a modest inheritance, which mysteriously vanished. Lillian returned to Padstow shortly after. Miss Marple turned the letter over and over in her hands. And then, someone here recognized her. That's what this is, I think. Not just murder, but silencing. That evening, she sent out handwritten invitations for a modest supper gathering at the vicarage. The guest list included Mr. Denholm, the Channings, Constable Griggs, and oddly, young Bethany from the tea tent, who had stumbled across the jar. They arrived in good form, drawn by curiosity and the unspoken lure of answers. Miss Marple served shepherd's pie and lemon drizzle cake. Conversation tiptoed around the murder like dancers avoiding a crack in the floor. And then she began. Mr. Denholm, did you know Lillian from before she returned to the village? He swallowed. Not especially. She was a child when she left. Funny. She told Mrs. Vane that she had dirt on an innkeeper who once helped someone disappear. Mr. Denholm bristled. That's absurd. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Channing. And you? Dear, your husband was once a solicitor in London, wasn't he? Left the profession suddenly, rather scandalously, if I remember. Around the same time as that inheritance vanished, Mrs. Channing paled, fingers tightening around her napkin. I believe Lillian returned because she thought she had power over both of you. Miss Marple said gently. She knew secrets. Perhaps she even intended to blackmail one, or both. Mr. Denholm stood sharply. This is outrageous. Miss Marple raised one hand. Do sit, Mr. Denholm. I'm not accusing anyone. Yet. She turned to Bethany. Now, dear, the jar you found, you mentioned it clinked. That suggests something inside it. A coin, a ring, perhaps? Bethany nodded. Yes, I took it to Constable Griggs this morning. The constable stepped forward, holding up a small object in a plastic bag. It was a signet ring. From the estate Lillian's employer once owned, Miss Marple confirmed. It was supposed to be missing, presumed stolen. Lillian must have hidden it here for leverage. She looked around the table. So someone knew. Someone panicked. And in that panic, they killed. The room went still. Miss Marple's eyes, pale blue and full of quiet thunder, rested on each guest in turn. I don't need to name the killer tonight, she said, because they already know who they are. And soon, everyone else will too. She smiled softly. Funny, isn't it? How a simple jar could cause such a noise. And with that, she rose, signaling the end of the supper and the beginning of the end. Chapter 10. The jar that clinked at midnight. Drawing room of old Ashen Grange was eerily silent, save for the gentle ticking of the long case clock and the faint rustling of leaves outside. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of irritation and reluctant curiosity. Beside him, Miss Marple, serene as ever, whereupon calmly, as if she hadn't just requested every central figure in the case to gather in the room, Hugh Willows, pale and drawn, sat stiffly in the corner chair. Beatrice Vole, dressed immaculately but lacking her usual edge, perched uneasily on the armrest. Mrs. Bartlett, clutching a lace handkerchief, sniffled quietly, while her husband sat beside her, avoiding everyone's gaze. Only Thomas the footman stood near the doorway, a look of resigned nervousness on his face. I must thank you all, Miss Marple began gently, for indulging me. I believe we owe it to poor Mr. Mortlake to fully understand what happened to him. It is only fair, Cray sighed. Miss Marple, if you've brought us here to confirm the earlier conclusions, I haven't, Inspector. She interrupted kindly. You see, I believe Mr. Mortlake's death was not merely unfortunate. It was murder, deliberate and coldly calculated. And the solution, as it often is, lay not in the extraordinary, but in the very ordinary. A shiver passed through the room. The jar, she said softly, looking at Thomas. Thomas blinked. The jar, ma'am? Yes, the old jar that clinked at midnight. When I heard it, I thought it was nothing but a dropped item. But then I remembered this house has very old floorboards. Any movement at night is echoed more than one expects. Especially in the larder. She turned to Beatrice. You heard the sound too, didn't you? Beatrice nodded slowly. Her expression taut. Miss Marple continued. The clink wasn't from a dropped utensil. It was the sound of a jar being moved, one with a false bottom. A very clever hiding place for something precious or incriminating. There was a beat of silence before Cray said, "Go on." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. Mr. Mortlake was a man with many secrets, but none more dangerous than what he'd discovered about someone else. I believe he had come upon something perhaps blackmail-worthy, the secret of a betrayal. He meant to reveal it. That was why he called for the meeting with Hugh the day after the garden party. Hugh stiffened. He never said, "No, but I suspect you felt it," Miss Marple said gently. His tone was heavy that night, and he'd become a changed man, hadn't he? Withdrawn, almost afraid. Beatrice, her voice hoarse, asked, "Then who?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the least suspected in the room. "Mrs. Bartlett," she said. A gasp escaped Beatrice's lips. Even Cray blinked. But Mrs. Bartlett didn't flinch. "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your past, Mrs. Bartlett, was never quite as respectable as you wished it to appear. And Mr. Mortlake," he knew. The older woman's face began to change, not with shock, but with resignation. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "I believe Mr. Mortlake knew you years ago when you went by another name. There was a scandal in Kent, wasn't there? A disappearance, a man gone missing, never solved. You fled, rebuilt your life here, and married a decent man. But then Mortlake returned. He recognized you. Perhaps he intended to expose you. Or perhaps he only wanted leverage." Tears sprang to Mrs. Bartlett's eyes, but she said nothing. Miss Marple sighed. "You poisoned his brandy. Something subtle, digitalis, perhaps easy to obtain if one knows old remedies. But to remove the glass and the vial, you needed to move quietly. You hid the bottle's remains in a false-bottomed jar in the larder, replacing it in the dead of night. Hence the clink I heard." Cray slowly turned toward Mrs. Bartlett. "Is this true?" Still no answer. But then Mr. Bartlett spoke, his voice low. "I knew something wasn't right. I found the old jar when I was moving things yesterday. It had a small vial in it. I didn't understand, so I said nothing." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "You see, human nature rarely changes. We may think we've buried the past, but it has a curious habit of catching up." Mrs. Bartlett finally raised her eyes. "He would have ruined everything. My life, my husband, my respectability. I couldn't bear it." "I understand," Miss Marple said softly. "But there were other ways." Cray took a long breath. "She'll have to come with me." Double quotes. Mrs. Bartlett didn't resist as she rose. Her husband followed, stunned and silent. The door closed behind them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Beatrice stood, brushing down her dress. "Well," she muttered, "that was extraordinary." Hugh, still pale, managed a weak smile. "Miss Marple, I must admit I never imagined it would be her." "That," Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting, "is the very nature of evil. Mr. Willows, it hides behind the most familiar of faces." Beatrice let out a breath. "And you noticed all this just from a clink in the night?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "One hears a great many things, my dear. The trick is knowing which ones to listen to." Epilogue. The stillness after the storm. 12 weeks later. St. Mary Mead had returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. The garden pots were swept, the tea shops once again filled with idle chatter, and the Grange, while quiet, stood firm against the gossip still circling like faint ripples in the pond. Miss Marple sat near her window, a shawl over her shoulders, a new ball of wool in her lap. Her hands moved gently, rhythmically, as the autumn wind whispered through the branches. A clink this time of a teacup on a saucer sounded beside her. Her niece, Joan, had returned from market. Still thinking about the case? Joan asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Only about how easy it is to mistake gentility for innocence. She looked out the window at the winding paths of the village, her mind already weaving a new pattern of human nature, one she would someday understand, before anyone else even noticed it had begun.